and we're just gonna start shortly, but if you would love to tell us where you are coming from in the chat, we would love to know. Oh, hang on 1 second. I can't see the chat on my other screen. There we go. Ooh, we got Chilliwack, Mission, Abbotsford. Right on, guys. We're so happy that you're here. Moving the stuff around here. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Patricia. I am from the Fraser Valley Conservancy, and I am the Step to It coordinator and volunteer coordinator. I'm going to introduce my coworker, Lovepreet. She's going to be working in the background and monitoring the chat.
Hi, I'm Lovepreet.
There you go. She is. And so we're going to hold our questions until the very end. And we've also got Kathy here as well from the Fraser Valley Invasive Species Society, and she's going to be doing the vast majority of this presentation for you. But before we get started, I'm just going to go over our agenda here. So I'm going to talk about us and us as the Fraser Valley Conservancy, that is, and the Step to It program and what we do, and our habitat healers and how you can get involved in upcoming events. And then Kathy's going to do her presentation, and then we will take questions at the very end. And I'm going to kindly ask that if you do have any questions that you put them in the chat. And if you see a question that you were wondering about as well, just like that, and then we can reduce the amount of questions that we go through in the chat there as well. So I'm going to start with a lovely land acknowledgement that the Fraser Valley respectfully acknowledges that we do work on the sacred and unceded territory of the Stalo peoples in the Fraser Valley, and we honor and respect their land, and we commit to working alongside Indigenous communities to protect and restore the natural environment. Now, some of you may know that who we are, the FVC, the Fraser Valley Conservancy is, but for those of you who don't know, we are a local land trust and a charitable organization that helps to protect and enhance natural areas. We work together with communities to be able to do this kind of work, and we mainly focus on stewardship, education, and conservation. And part of that is the Step to It program. So the Step to It program is the community outreach arm of the FEC. And Step to It, we encourage actions like reducing waste, conserving resources, and adopting eco-friendly habits. Our goal is to create engaged communities across the Fraser Valley by providing the knowledge, tools, and support needed to replenish and restore the natural areas that surround them. And you can see Lovepreet's putting some links in the chat there for you if you want to learn more as well. So what is Habitat Healers? Habitat Healers is one of the ways that we do all of that work. And we call Habitat Healers our volunteers, or at least that's what we call our volunteers, as Habitat Healers. The Habitat Healers program was developed to bring our nature-loving volunteers together under one roof. Paired with the Service Seed Rewards program, you have a chance to collect points to gain rewards for your efforts as a Habitat Healer volunteer. Our main motto is learn, do, and share. So you can learn new skills or brush up on old ones. And by doing your part, you can attend any of our amazing events and help us reach our goals as well, which are long and vast. And this year we have a goal of trying to reduce 100 tons of CO2 and that we're doing with contests, with composting, saving water, saving electricity, and by also planting trees. We usually do that in the fall. And you can share all this as well by being an ambassador for positive change. You can do this by sharing our posts on social media or by talking to your friends, family, and neighbors as well. So if you want to get involved, there are so many ways to get involved. So we have our monthly volunteer and events bulletin, and that goes out once a month, usually the last Wednesday of every month. And then we take a short break in the off seasons as well, or if we're not doing anything. And so you can subscribe to that on our website. And yeah, it just gives all the upcoming things for the next 4 to 6 weeks. And so our next one is set to come out next week, actually, if you want to register for that and subscribe to it. You can volunteer with us out in the field, at events, working behind the scenes with us, and to support FEC staff as well. There's so many different ways to volunteer. You can join our board of directors or any of our other supporting committees as well. So that's background stuff as well. If you don't want to go pull some plants, right, and invasive species or doing that back-breaking labor. You can also share social media, expand our digital footprint. It's such a powerful way to get our message out and to reach a wider, broader audience as well to be able to continue the work that we're doing. And of course, last but not least, donations as well. Donations help in so many ways, including being able to host workshops such as this one. Any type of donation, big or small, it makes the world of difference for us. So we thank anybody who donates their time or any type of money to us as well. We appreciate it. So we've got some upcoming events. So after you've learned about all these lovely invasive species, if you get the itch to come out with us, we do have a few upcoming invasive species events coming up. So we have actually one this coming Saturday at Centennial Park in Mission. I'm super duper excited about that. I believe we're going to be tackling yellow flag iris there. So if you want to get your hands dirty, please come and join us. It's usually always in the morning for a couple hours, and then we wrap up and send you on your way. And if you want to join our next one as well, we have one next Saturday in Abbotsford at Fish Trap Creek. And then another one at the end of June at Lane Creek, where we've been for 3 years now. I'm super excited about that. It's been such a wild ride being there on June 21st. And so you can sign up by scanning the QR code or going to our events calendar that Lovepreet has posted in the chat there. So without further ado, I will stop muttering and boring you with all these lovely details and let Kathy do her thing. Sounds good? You excited? Ready to rock?
Great.
There you go, Kathy.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to share my screen real quick.
You betcha.
And just making sure that everyone can see this. Yes? Cool, great. All right, well, thank you for being here. And thank you to the Conservancy for inviting us to attend and speak to all of you who have taken time out of your evening on a Thursday night to come and listen to me talk about invasive plants. I'm super appreciative of your time, and thank you for being here. And hopefully you've got your tea, your dinner, whatever, and you're ready to learn, because this is going to be kind of information packed. Feel free to add any of your questions into the chat, and you can upvote the questions that you are interested in hearing my answers to. And that helps to increase the likelihood I'll be able to answer them before we run out of time for the evening. So like mentioned, my name is Kathy. I am from the Fraser Valley Invasive Species Society. We are a local nonprofit, also in the environmental realm, and our goal is to decrease the negative impacts of invasive species in the Fraser Valley. We operate within the same boundaries as the Fraser Valley Regional District on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Stalo people. Here are our socials and our contact information if you'd like to give us a follow. That'd be great. We do share a bunch of information as we go through things. Right now, if you are following us, it is Invasive Species Action Month. So all the more reason for you to head out there, take part in some of the Conservancy's events on Saturdays. It's supposed to be a good Saturday weather day. So hopefully you can join them and actually do some invasive species action during the month of May. So we try to take actions to achieve our mandate by attending public events. We do a lot of training sessions, presentations like these. We sometimes will also do community weed pulls, but largely we do a lot of coordination and a lot of on-the-ground work through the roadside and other land manager programs for invasive species management. We also do extra projects where grant funding allows, like lake monitoring for invasive mussels throughout the Fraser Valley. So like I mentioned, we are part of a network of invasive species councils across the entire province. This is actually really unique in North America. There are no other provinces in Canada that have such a vast number of invasive species committees and councils around the province. And we actually all work very closely together. We have monthly phone calls where we discuss how to collaborate better together. We keep an eye out for any new invaders. As we like to remind everyone, invasive species do not care about boundaries. They do not care about fences or borders. They grow where they grow, and they go where they go. So in order to achieve success when it comes to managing invasive species, we all have to work together, we have to collaborate, and we all have to be on the same page. So if you're ever traveling throughout the province, feel free to reach out to any of our counterparts across the province to report or just learn more about the invasive species that are priority in those regions. So you're here to learn about invasive species. What are invasive species? Most of the time when people talk to me about invasive species, we're thinking about plants. But just so you know, invasive species can be any species. It can be plants, it can be fish, it can be pathogens, insects, birds, wildlife, etc. Today, we will be focusing on plants, but I do want you to know what the definition of an invasive species is. So invasive species, typically there's a lot of words that get thrown around when it comes to invasive species. You might hear the word alien or weedy, noxious, or exotic. Alien is a very outdated term. Similar to exotic, they both refer to plants that are just not native. They're not from here, and they have been introduced. Weedy or weeds are just plants that are growing in an area where we don't want them to. And that's very subjective. And that's what a weed is. It doesn't really denote any specific type of plant. It's all about preference. And then there's noxious, and I like to say noxious with a capital N. Noxious is actually a legal term. So when you read our legislation, if it says noxious weed or noxious plant, that is a legal definition or a legal term for invasive plants. But when practitioners and people who work in this realm refer to invasive species or invasive plants, there are actually 3 criteria that that species needs to meet in order to be called an invasive species. So 1, it needs to be non-native, so it needs to be introduced from elsewhere. Number 2, it needs to reproduce very quickly, meaning that it doesn't have competition or predators that keep the populations under control. And thirdly, and most importantly, invasive species cause harm. Just because a plant is non-native, like our tomatoes or cherry blossoms, does not make it invasive. It needs to cause economic harm by costing damage that needs to be, you have to pay to fix it. It needs to cause social harm, for example, invading park spaces, so preventing use of a lake, for example, or causing social harm like causing burns on your skin, etc. Or most likely, what you're thinking about is environmental harm. And just because a species is acting invasively if it's acting invasively, does not mean that it is invasive. So one example I like to use are horsetail up in the top corner there. Horsetail gets reported to me quite a lot. It's actually a native plant. So even though it's spreading very quickly without competition, and it might be causing you harm on your property, it is a native plant. So it is not labeled as an invasive species. So these three criteria is what needs to be met in order for us to call something an invasive species. So what are their impacts? A lot of invasive species can cause infrastructure damage. For example, knotweed growing through asphalt here. Himalayan balsam here blocks water movement and therefore wildlife movement in waterways. We have human health risks, like I mentioned. This is giant hogweed, which causes really severe burns on humans and animals. English ivy here can damage trees and really displace other plants and take over an area. Scotch broom here blocks sight lines, causing it to be hazardous when you're driving on certain roadsides or trying to pull out of driveways. Burdock here, unfortunately, have very sticky seeds that spread very quickly, but it also impacts our wildlife by catching onto the delicate wings of birds and bats and unfortunately preventing them from escaping. Or it can be other damage like pushing out other plants or preventing the use of a space. So this is orange hawkweed that's invaded a pasture. Cows and other livestock do not eat hairy plants like orange hogweed, and eventually that pasture becomes unusable because it's been taken over by a plant that isn't being grazed on. So when we see invasive species infestations, what we're actually seeing is a lack of balance. We're seeing the invasive species, which I like to tell kids when I do presentations to them, as plant bullies who take over a space and they don't allow for our native species to coexist peacefully with them in that same space. So my goals today is, again, we're only going to focus on plants today, but I want you to leave my presentation with an understanding of how invasive species have become an issue, how we sometimes help them spread, and some control options and how to think, like what to consider when you're selecting methods when you're tackling your own invasive species. So I'll be illustrating this to start with the story of knotweed's journey around the world. If you haven't heard of knotweed before, I highly recommend that you do a little bit of Googling and search up knotweed and learn more about it. It is a plant that we are putting a lot of effort into trying to remove from the region. It is very problematic, which I'll be explaining in a little bit. But it is a plant that has a whole journey around the world in order to be here. And there's a reason why it is invasive and why it causes impacts to our region that makes it very difficult to control. So here's a little knotweed plant. It's growing through some concrete there, but it's called Japanese knotweed because it comes from Japan. Japan is known to be very seismically active. So there's a lot of earthquakes, there's a lot of volcanoes, active volcanoes. So a plant that has evolved in that space needs to be able to survive through an inhospitable environment. It needs to be able to grow in loose, rough, nutrient-less soil, not even really soil. It needs to be able to withstand frequent eruptions, so getting buried over and over and over again and still being able to survive. And that's not even mentioning all the other insects and diseases, herbivory and pathogens that help to keep knotweed populations under control in its where its land of origin in Japan. So how does it do that? How does it withstand and survive through all of that? Well, this plant has a bit of a special weapon. And if you're a gardener, you might be familiar with this word, but it's got rhizomes. Rhizomes are not roots. A lot of people call them roots, but it is, I think of them as underground stems, meaning that they grow and they split and they get pruned and they grow just like a stem, but underground. This also means that rhizomes can connect above ground stems. So you might be on top of the surface of the ground, seeing multiple plants without realizing that they are actually connected below ground via these rhizomes. It's a strategy for survival and spread because rhizomes also typically fragment very easily. And each of those little fragments, sometimes as small as 1 centimeter, can grow an entire new plant. I have been to sites where we found pieces, just little fragments of knotweed, and after about a week, we see that amount of growth in that bottom photo there. Knotweed is a plant that can grow 10 centimeters a day. It can grow, the root system can grow as deep as 3 meters up to 20 meters across. And so it's important to know that with knotweed, what you see above ground is not reflective of what's happening below ground. And I actually liken it, rhizomes specifically, to potatoes. We've all had potatoes in the back of our cupboard. We bought it, we forgot it, and then suddenly it's starting to grow in the darkness, right? It doesn't need light, it doesn't need water, it doesn't need to be planted. All the things that it needs to grow is right there in that potato, just like a rhizome. And how do we grow more potatoes? We cut them up and we plant those little eyes. Those fragments grow more potatoes. Similar with rhizomes, each piece can grow another plant, and it can be very small. So this is one strategy that's allowed for knotweed to be very tenacious when it comes to spreading and surviving. So, like I said, it needs to survive through these variables. So what does that mean? It's adapted a couple of things as a plant. It means that it can grow almost anywhere. It doesn't need root hairs because it doesn't grow in soil the way that we think about it. It doesn't rely on above ground plant parts because it has all it needs in its rhizomes. It's got a massive root system with the rhizomes, very deep, very wide. And it can easily fragment. And because it evolved on in an area where it's getting repeatedly buried, it can push through hard surfaces. So this is a plant that has all these traits. And now, what do? We bring it over to North America. We bring it over to the Fraser Valley. Knotweed was introduced to North America as an ornamental plant. It has beautiful flowers in August and grows very quickly, which is desirable for a lot of people. And it actually spread through cuttings trading and then just improper management of this plant that has helped it to spread all across the continent. Like I mentioned, knotweed spreads very quickly by plant parts. So it doesn't need the seeds in order, or reproductive seed pollination in order to spread. All it needs are little plant fragments and people helping it to spread and trading it across the continent. So now that knotweed's in North America and specifically in the Fraser Valley, what does that mean? Well, it's got all these adaptations, right? Those adaptations have now become impacts. That means that in the Fraser Valley, it can grow in places where other plants can't. It doesn't hold soil because it doesn't have those fine root hairs, so it becomes an erosion risk when it grows along stream banks. It doesn't rely on above ground plant parts, meaning that mowing, cutting doesn't actually make any difference to it and actually can usually stimulate aggressive regrowth. It's got that massive root rhizome system, very deep, very wide, which crowds out other plants, preventing them from growing. And each piece can grow a new plant since the stems and roots can get easily fragmented. And finally, because it can push through hard surfaces, in our seismically active space, it can exploit these little tiny microfractures whenever our house settles or foundations settle, and it grows through those little cracks. And as those rhizomes get thicker and thicker, it can damage infrastructure and damage concrete and asphalt. So those adaptations and impacts have allowed a plant that looks like this in Japan, small, kind of stressed looking, to something that looks like this in the Fraser Valley. So this is a site out by Hope that was a real concern. Here's another angle of it up top in that top left corner. And what you can't tell is that there's a house behind there. That was a very problematic site for us because there was a resident who needed medical assistance and the ambulance couldn't find their driveway because the knotweed had completely obscured the view of it. So it's a sightline concern. It's a real hazard in that sense. Like I mentioned, it doesn't have fine root hairs, so it is also an erosion risk where it can just sloof right off on the sides of banks and streams, and it can grow through hard surfaces like asphalt, walls, foundations, etc. In the UK, if you have knotweed, you cannot get a mortgage. You have to treat it before you can sell your house. You cannot get insurance if you have it. It is a real problem, and we learn from the UK and we try to manage it so that those impacts to their housing market does not also impact us here. So this is just one example of how a non-native plant from elsewhere can be moved here and cause damage to our area. I apologize. I live across from the fire hall, so you might hear some sirens in a little bit. So that was just one example. So we can talk about some other examples. One that I like to talk about is giant hogweed. Giant hogweed is a big, tall flower. It's very toxic. And it was also brought in as an ornamental import. Some people love their big, tall flowers. It can grow up to 5 meters high, and each plant can produce 120,000 seeds that remain viable for up to 15 years in the soil. All it takes is one plant to create an infestation. Like I mentioned, this is a very toxic plant. This is a WorkSafe BC plant warning because it can cause very severe burns. The sap is UV light activated, and it can lead to blisters, scarring, burns that keep reoccurring every year anytime that person re-enters sunlight. Wild chervil is another one, also an ornamental import. It was brought into North America to replicate the English countryside. It's got these beautiful small white flowers, but it's got a very deep taproot because it is in the carrot family, meaning that this is a very difficult plant to remove by physical means. You can't really dig it out because the taproot is so deep. But that deep taproot also allows it to withstand a lot of different herbicides. So you have to use specific types of herbicides in order to get rid of this plant. An example of sometimes invasive plants can spread very quickly when things change is the flood. So on that bottom photo there with all the blue points, those are all of my wild chervil sites in the Fraser Valley, specifically in the Sumas Prairie. After the flood, which occurred in that same space, we have now begun to see really incredible spread of this plant. These are some photos of how it has spread onto neighboring properties, onto rail lines, and we in the Fraser Valley is the core infestation for the entire province for this plant, meaning that now our strategy has had to change from trying to eradicate it, trying to get rid of it, to trying to contain it because it has, the toothpaste has escaped the tube at this point. We can't put it back in. So the management strategy is to contain it and to keep it to the Lower Mainland and protect the rest of the province. And so that's where some of our work comes in, is coordination with the rest of the other invasive species committees across the province. So when they do see this plant entering their region, they jump on it very quickly and prevent it from establishing. And a last example of another invasive plant that has really caused significant impacts is Scotch broom. Scotch broom was brought to North America by some folks who were homesick and loved seeing this plant from their ancestral home. And now Scotch broom is growing along roadsides. It's got these exploding seed pods that help it spread even quicker. And this plant is actually really interesting. It has phytotoxins that it releases from the roots, meaning that it prevents other plants from growing in its surroundings, only allowing for their own seedlings to establish and emerge. So oftentimes you'll see empty spaces around Scotchroom plants because of that phytotoxin. This plant is also a wildfire fuel risk. It is flammable, those especially as it kind of dries up, which is a real concern. In the Fraser Valley, we are mostly concerned about this in the canyon area because it is much drier up there, and the fire risk is higher up there. On the island, this plant has become a real problem. So here's some aerial photos of Forest Service roads and utility lines where by accident, in this Scotch broom seeds were introduced, and now it has spread very quickly. So like I mentioned, invasive species, the infestations is a sign of a lack of balance. And a lot of the impacts from that is simply because there is a lack of balance. There's a lack of competition. There's a lack of ability by our native plants from coming back in and continuing to grow when they're being pushed out. So I've already alluded to some different ways of how we help them spread, but there are a couple different ways that we might help invasive plants spread without even really realizing it. So one is seed bombing. You might have noticed, I keep highlighting the plants that are ornamental imports because a lot of the invasive plants that we deal with are beautiful plants. People plant them on purpose because they have beautiful flowers, but they don't realize that it can create problems later on if they're not careful and they're not monitoring it. Sometimes the seed pods can explode and the seeds get spread further and further without even realizing it. So we try to remind people that if you are going to be using seed mixes, especially mixes, to be very careful about what you're planting. And we recommend that you learn more by reading some of our blog posts on it. But this is a consideration if you're going out there and you're trying to add to your biodiversity, to maybe check what kind of mix you're planting, know what you're growing, and whether or not those plants are actually native to here, or if it's native to elsewhere, but we're bringing it in. Another good intention that we do sometimes that we don't realize helps invasive plants spread is we might be going out there, enjoying nature, and really appreciating the wild spaces that we have in the Fraser Valley. But then we emerge from those wild spaces completely covered in seeds and other plant fragments. If we're not cleaning those off, we are helping these invasive plants spread. So we ask folks to check your shoes, your pants, your tires, and even your dogs to make sure that you're not accidentally helping invasive plants spread. Another way is improper disposal. Sometimes we spend a lot of effort removing invasive plants only to dispose of it improperly. For example, composting something that allows it to just come right back. So we recommend that people take a little bit more time to kind of think about rhizomes and seeds. I've already talked a lot about rhizomes and why it's really important that we prevent it from being viable if you're trying to prevent that plant from regrowing. Seeds is another one, right? Like if these two items are meant to be buried in order to grow, then maybe composting is not the right answer. And typically when people reach out, I tell them to treat rhizomes, roots, and seeds carefully and differently compared to the rest of the plant. And lastly, we might also plant indiscriminately. We don't know what we're planting. We're choosing improper plants. A lot of folks, they try to fill in gaps in their gardens, right? You see a bare space and you want to increase the biodiversity in your garden space. And you choose things, especially folks who are new to gardening, they choose plants that are, unkillable, fast growing, low maintenance, resistant. And I like to highlight that if a plant is being sold to you as deer and rabbit resistant or hardy or can adapt to a various multitude of growing conditions, then what happens if you can't control it? If deer won't eat it, then what will, right? So please be aware of what you're growing and putting into your property if you can. And there are resources out there, especially if you Google grow me instead. There are guides out there that give you native and better alternatives that are non-invasive. And lastly, and this is a bit of a segue, sometimes we help invasive plants spread by choosing the wrong control method. And that happens when we don't think about how does this plant spread? How is it growing? What are the weak spots that we should be targeting? And whether or not our efforts are helping or hurting the area that we're trying to restore and protect. So that's my nice little segue into what do we do about it? Hopefully by now you understand why invasive species are a problem and some of the impacts that it can cause to our surroundings. And now I'd like to tell you some considerations that you should maybe keep in mind when you're deciding to take action on invasive species, and kind of this little toolbox we call the integrated pest management toolbox that you can use in order to choose the right tool for the job. But before we even go into the toolbox, I like to mention that the main thing, the most important thing we can do when it comes to invasive species management is to prevent. And I cannot use the word prevent enough times. Prevention is the key to getting ahead of major problems. That means choosing appropriately what you're planting, cleaning your gear, knowing what you have, not helping hitchhikers, moving soil and other materials carefully, and disposing it properly. These are all steps that we can take to prevent infestations, because the goal is not to help the invasive species, and the goal is also to not just move the problem somewhere else. And I like to illustrate this with, this is the invasion curve. We use this a lot when we're trying to show the relationship between the invasion timeline, so that's going horizontally, and then the cost and areas affected. So the higher it goes, the more it costs to fix it, and the more area is impacted. Obviously, as a new species enters an area, after prevention, if we can't prevent it, then if there's just a couple little small infestations, we try to eradicate it. That's when eradication is possible, when you only have a couple plants. Next step is to contain it. So on a landscape level or your backyard space level, are you trying to contain a certain area and protect other areas? And then eventually it gets to the control phase where the species is widespread, it's abundant, and long-term management is required with strategic actions and planning. Usually, and more importantly, the best time, the easiest efforts, the lowest cost is when we do work during the prevent and eradicate steps. This is what's called early detection rapid response. There are provincial plans that have a provincial level early detection rapid response plans. For us, we also have regional priority lists that actually stipulates which species are prevent species for the Fraser Valley, which species are eradicate species in the Fraser Valley, because we only have, I don't know, 10 sites. And which species are just so widespread that it is more values-based protection that we're doing. More often than not, we don't even realize that there's a problem until that stage, right after it's too late to even contain it, because that's when there's so much of a specific plant that it's caught us off guard, and there's not a lot of action we can take anymore because it's become so widespread. So at that stage, we realize it's a concern, but eradication is not an option. So we have to be strategic in our planning. We have to prioritize which species we tackle, which areas we protect. And this is where you guys come in, protect the areas that are important. Our work at the Invasive Species Society, we focus our limited funding on the prevent and eradicate side of things. If we do our job right with prevention and eradication, you won't know that we've done anything at all. That is the goal, is if we do those things right, it will not continue on to contain or control parts of the invasion curve. The species that you do see everywhere right now are in that control and values protection stage of the invasion curve. But it's still important, right? It's still invading, it's still damaging natural areas and infrastructure and other values that are important to us. So your actions as habitat healers still help to protect special areas. And that's why the Conservancy, the Watersheds Coalition, and other stewardship groups around the region, they work in specific areas because they're protecting those important areas from invasive species. So, like I mentioned, it's a lack of balance when it comes to invasive species infestations. Our control efforts aims to restore some of that balance in this environment. So how do we do that? Well, before we even do or choose our control efforts and our control methods, we have to first understand how invasive species spread. Invasive plants spread typically by two different methods. There's the seeds spreading, and then there's the plant parts. Seeds are more like annuals, biannuals. Perennials can also spread by seed, but usually plant parts is the dominant way for perennials to spread because of that long-lasting root system that persists year after year, right? So, but these two methods are the ones that we start with whenever someone asks me how to manage a invasive plant in their property. First, I ask, what plant is it? And then I consider, is it spreading by seed or is it spreading by plant parts? Because that will influence which methods you choose. But before you even choose a method, you have to be prepared to be consistent and be persistent. Invasive species management is a long commitment. It is never a 1 year and done situation. And I always recommend that people have a game plan when you start going into it, because what usually happens is you go in there, you think you're going to tackle one plant, and you start removing it, and either that plant is actually more widespread than you expected, or as you start clearing it, you find other and more invasive plants. So be prepared to be consistent and be persistent and have a long-term strategy and plan for the year and ongoing. So let's talk about seed spreaders. So here are some examples. Butterfly bush, 100,000 seeds per plant. Himalayan balsam, 800 per plant with exploding seed pods, and orange hawkweed with 10,000 seeds per plant. It really doesn't take a lot to create an infestation. So these plants, it's really important that your methods are done, whichever method you choose, is done at the right time. You want to get in there before the seeds that is being targeted that you're trying to prevent. You're getting in there before the seeds are being dropped, before they're forming, ideally not long past flowering, and you're tackling it before it's able to produce those many seeds. With plant parts, now you're thinking about the plant fragments, right? So if you're not sure, any plants out there that say that it's easy to propagate, you can put it in water and it'll grow roots. Those are plant part spreaders. So English ivy is an example of that. If you mow that, you're gonna get fragments, and each of those fragments become a new plant. Same with periwinkle. That's one of the reasons why it grows so quickly is the mower goes through, it's a low growing plant, and then it scatters the pieces, and next thing you know, it's a giant infestation. And I've already mentioned knotweed as well. It is another plant that spreads by fragments, and it is important that with plant part spreaders, you choose the right method. If you're mowing it, you're creating pieces, then you might be making the problem worse instead of better. Mowing does not work on all plants. And sometimes when we don't think too hard about plants and don't realize that plants are quite complicated, we default to mowing, we default to digging, and it doesn't always work for everything. So I want to go back to the integrated pest management toolbox. So it's called the integrated pest management toolbox because you are not limited to a single method. And usually the more different methods you can use at different times of the year, at different life stages of the plant, helps to increase the success of your management. You can kind of think of it as death by a thousand cuts, right? You want to be able to get at it at different times, different parts, because eventually the combined efforts will lead to control success. There are four main control methods in the toolbox. The ones that really impact you, that you have access to, are mechanical and chemical. But because a lot of the guides that I'll be mentioning mention all four of these, I'm just going to quickly go through them so you have an understanding of what they mean when they say cultural or biological control. So first up, cultural control. This is more in like a farming agricultural context. So crop rotation, co-planting, better soil, resistant varieties. Those are different cultural controls that apply in those situations, but it doesn't really apply when you're trying to manage an invasive species. But it is good for you to know that sometimes this might be illustrated in guides as an option for you to understand that this is what they're referring to. The one example that might be applicable when it comes to cultural control are the resistant varieties. So I mentioned butterfly bush previously. Butterfly bush is invasive, but there are sterile varieties of butterfly bush that are non-invasive because they have been bred to be sterile. So if you were planting butterfly bush because you want butterfly bush for whatever reason, you can choose to grow the non-invasive version. Biological control is another method in the toolbox. So that's when agents, so insects or pathogens, are released and targeted to that plant that is trying to be controlled. So some examples that we have in the Fraser Valley include the cinnabar moth up top, and then we also have some beetles and stem boring beetles and weevils, purple loosestrife down there, and then St. John's wort on the left there, that target those plants specifically. Because this is a landscape level control method, this is not something that's available to you, but you can monitor for it. So say you were tackling tansy ragwort on your property and you see that caterpillar, those are our insect friends that's actually helping to keep the populations overall under control. The difficulty with biological control is that you always need to have some plants remaining to keep the insect population present. Like these insects need to eat something. And if they're targeting and they only feed on that specific plant, if we remove all of it, then these beneficial insect friends don't have any food anymore, right? So it is a landscape level, a big bird's eye view method, and not really meant for small gardens and yards. But now we're going to talk about mechanical control, which is a method that you can use. I did include excavation on the list because if you are one of those folks with giant properties and your own little mini excavator, this might be an option that you might use. But typically it's hand pulling, cutting, mowing, digging, smothering a little bit as well. So what do we think about when we're choosing mechanical control methods? So it can be effective on both seed and plant part spreaders. But some considerations you want to keep in mind is before you even tackle the space and the plant, is this plant easy to remove? If it's not, then is mechanical options the right choice? Is it a small enough patch for you to remove? Do you have the ability, the physical ability to do it yourself? Can you get in there before seeding? A lot of times, especially if it's a plant that seeds in the winter and you can't get in there because of the snow, then maybe it's not the right method to choose. Is the location even feasible? Is the plant growing under paved stones? Can you even get at it, right? And then afterwards, what other uses do you want to use the space for? Mechanical control methods are really targeted to prevent seeding, so removing it or cutting the seed heads off to prevent seeds from dropping, or removing the roots as much as possible to prevent it from regrowing. And it is labor intensive and it is very difficult, especially you have large patches. So considering whether or not it's even feasible before you even start is really important so that you do not start a project that you cannot be consistent and persistent with, because otherwise your efforts will just go to waste. I did want to spend a little bit of time on smothering. This is another option, but is a method that needs to be done with careful thought. It is not a method that can be used in all areas. Not every space can be smothered, especially in areas where there's a lot of like water movement or high traffic areas. I have used smothering in certain areas where people have stolen my barriers, right? So is the location you're trying to use it feasible? Does it work? And more importantly for smothering, how long can you do this for? It really impacts the space for a long amount of time. And typically a lot of the plants that require this method needs at least a growing year, at least a year, maybe even 2 years before you will see proper results. And finally, will smothering work for the plant that you're targeting? Some plants go dormant when they're smothered. And then once you lift that barrier off, it comes right back up. So if you're using smothering on a plant that will just wait you out, then it's not going to be very feasible. And you've just clear cut a part of your yard and impacted all the other surrounding vegetation without actually impacting the plant that you're targeting. And then finally, there's cost. Sometimes these barriers are really, really expensive, and we don't always have the ability to pay for some of those options. So, and finally, afterward, what are you going to use in the space? Because you never want to be leaving bare dirt, bare ground for potentially other invasives to come in. We always want to be filling those spaces and allowing for either surrounding native plants to come back and regrow in that space, or planting native plants to prevent bare ground for invasive seeds to kind of blow in and establish before our native plants can. While we're talking about mechanical methods, I want to quickly talk about goats. So goats is a method that is commonly suggested. And just like cutting, mowing, goats only work in specific environments. And more importantly, is this even an option that's available to us? In Alberta, there are herds that you can rent. And actually, I think parts of the Kootenays, there might be some herds up there too. But to my knowledge, there aren't any herds available for rent in the Fraser Valley. And then it comes down to also the size of the infestation. Like if it's a really large area, how many goats do you need? How many times do the goats have to come? What happens to the waste? And then can they get to an area where it's safe for the animals, but also a good timing to get at the plant before it sets seeds or starts to grow aggressively throughout the season. And then finally, what are the uses in the space afterward? Goats also have their own impacts, right? Like just eat the invasive plant. You can't really target them. It's not a very targeted, selected method. So honestly, in my mind, goats are very cute, furry lawnmowers, and not all plants can be lawn mowed. Some plants you need to target the roots, and that's not something that goats can typically do. If you are interested in learning more, though, Metro Vancouver actually created a targeted grazing feasibility report, so you can learn more about which species goats can be effective on, which species they can't be effective on, and how much, in a ballpark sense, how much it could cost. Right, next is chemical control. So this is another option that is available, but it is often the last resort, meaning that when those other methods that I've already listed are not practical. So some examples of applying chemicals or pesticides, in this case on plants, it's herbicides. It might be a targeted foliar spray. It could be stem injection if the stem is a hollow type stem. It could be wipe on or even cut and paint on. So there are targeted methods of using herbicides that can be selective to the plants that you're targeting without impacting the plants around you. But it needs to be done carefully and needs to be done with consideration about the location that you're on and what is surrounding the target plant that you're trying to remove. So again, it's when other methods are just not feasible. With the herbicides, typically when the patch is too big for mechanical methods, or if the roots are too deep for you to feasibly dig it out, chemical options become something that can be considered. Or sometimes the plants are too close to structures. So if there's a knotweed plant growing right beside a house and you can't actually dig it out, then maybe the chemical option is what you have to go with. But even then, there are considerations, right? Like if the plant that you're targeting is near water, near sensitive areas, near a vegetable garden, maybe chemical options are not the answer. So it all comes down to what that space is, what plant you're targeting, are there any other options that work, and what other uses that you're using in that space. And sometimes with infestations, chemical can be the only feasible option because of the way the plant grows and because of the size or the location of the infestation. So with herbicides, the goal is to target the roots, and more often than not, like I mentioned, especially if the plant is growing around other things like infrastructure, you want to minimize the ground disturbance. One thing I like to mention, and I like to hammer this home for anyone who is considering using herbicides, is that more herbicide does not mean it becomes more effective. Too much herbicide might have environmental considerations, but it could also burn the plant so much that you can't, like it doesn't work. So knowing the timing, usually applying it either before seed set, so you're preventing the seeds from developing, or in the fall when the plant is preparing for winter dormancy and it's drawing that herbicide into the roots and hitchhiking, the herbicide can hitchhike on that downward movement, is the ideal time. The timing becomes more effective and more important than the quantity of herbicide that you use. When we talk about chemicals, I want to also talk about the other things that people might use. So salt, vinegar, bleach, hot water. And I like to remind folks that invasive plants thrive in spaces where other plants don't. So when you use some of these other alternative substances, it's really important to keep in mind what else are you impacting. And when we look at the scale from native species and invasive species, which side are you actually helping when you use some of these alternative substances? So some examples include pH levels. Vinegar and bleach alter the pH levels, and it might impact the soil quality. Bleach can impact the microorganisms that are really important to soil health, or it might even impact dormant native plants underground with hot water. Like, what else are you killing when you're using these other substances? And how are you creating long-lasting impacts to the soil quality that you are relying on to be healthy in order to support the native plants that you're trying to reintroduce? And a word of caution with these alternative methods is sometimes you can't believe everything you read on the internet. Detergent, soap, like laundry detergent, is a common way of preventing moss from growing, especially on rooftops. But there has been examples like this one here in Langley where detergent was sprinkled on the rooftops of a townhouse complex, I believe, to prevent moss from growing on the roof. Great. And then the rain came and it washed that detergent into the neighboring creek. And now we have soap, laundry soap, sudsing up the neighboring creek. So it's really important to remember what else you're impacting when you're choosing these alternative methods. There's actually a really great blog post on this from the King County Weeds blog post. And it talks about more details about salt and vinegar and other methods and whether or not they are effective, when to use them and when to avoid them. If you're dealing with a situation like your pavement here, like cobblestones, paved stones, and you really don't have to worry about anything else, then maybe these other alternative methods can be an option. But just because something is natural, something that you can buy from the store and maybe you use all the time, does not mean that it does not have impacts. And finally, I want to touch on the aftermath and disposal. So it's really important when you're managing invasive plants that you have a game plan as to what you're going to do with the stuff afterward. You don't want to just move the problem to a new location, right? And if you dispose of things incorrectly, you might just let your hard work all go to waste simply because you've left a compost pile somewhere and then you use that compost back into your yard, and now you have the same problem all over again, and that invasive plant is back. So we ask folks to be considerate and have a plan as to what you're going to do with the material that you remove. We do have a list of disposal locations in the Fraser Valley on our website. And actually, depending on where you live in the Fraser Valley, Abbotsford, Chilliwack, electoral areas C, D, E, G, and H, we offer a curbside pickup of certain plants. We will come pick it up from you and we will actually bring it to the incinerator. This is a program paid for by the Fraser Valley Regional District. So if this is something that might interest you, please reach out and maybe we can help you during the season to remove your bags of removed invasive plants. So just a recap. So when you're controlling invasive plants, consider your goal. What do you want the space to look like? What is it going to look like afterward? Do you have the capacity to do the work that you're planning on? How do you plan on maintaining it, and how might you impact your neighbors? And more importantly, what happens in the future if you move away? Like, are these management efforts that you're starting, will they be continued? Or will they just kind of peter out after you leave? And that might impact what you choose to do and what scale you choose to do your actions. The next is know the biology of the plant that you're controlling. What are you targeting? Is it the seeds? Is it plant fragments? Is it the roots? When are you targeting it? Before the seed sets? During the fall when it's preparing for dormancy and it's weaker? Knowing the biology of the plant is the very first step for knowing how to tackle the invasive plant that you're dealing with. And to add to the complication, a lot of the areas in the Fraser Valley have a bunch of different invasive species, meaning that you might have to tackle the same area multiple times simply because there are different invasive plants in that area that need different methods at different times of the season. So knowing what you're doing making a plan so you're not caught off guard, and scheduling it in is the way to achieve success in managing invasive plants. Using multiple methods when you can and being persistent is also really important. So like I mentioned, having multiple ways from the toolbox of attacking the plant can help to increase your likelihood of success. So attacking different parts of the plant, different life stages, different times of the year, before seeding, after seeding, emerging when the roots are strong, and then at the end, again, when the roots are weak. That's how you can lead to a better likelihood of success in your efforts. But again, it is a lot of effort, so we always recommend coming up with a game plan first before you jump right into it. And finally, and maybe most importantly, you want to prevent further spread. You want to clean your gear. You don't want to further spread the plant that you're tackling, and you want to dispose of the material properly. It's really important when it comes to invasive plant management to embrace complexity. We live in a complex world, and it should be complex. It shouldn't be easy because we're surrounded by a whole variety of different wildlife and little biodiversity, and it needs to be complicated to support the variety and magnitude of the nature that surrounds us. There is no one-size-fits-all answer. And that is typically the difficulty when I get folks coming to me looking for help is what I tell one person might not be the same as the next person. What I tell one neighbor might not be the same as what I tell their directly adjacent neighbor. It all comes down to where it is, what you're dealing with, what time of year, the surroundings, and what you're using that space for, and what your capacity and level of effort is available. And some of that is very subjective to you as a person. And so only you can make those decisions in order to make your own game plan to tackle the invasive plants that you're treating. And it should be different. It should be complex. Here are two different photos of yellow flag iris, and they're about the same size, they're the same plant, but they're in entirely different locations. And we shouldn't be using the same brush for both of these sites. There should be different methods to remove this plant just simply because it's in two different locations, and you need to be considerate of the surrounding areas and the different values that you're trying to protect in those different areas. And finally, there are risks to your actions, but there are risks also from inaction. And that's up to you to weigh it. You have to decide whether or not those efforts are worth it and whether or not you have the ability to continue those efforts. We always try, evaluate, and then we try again. And we pivot if we need to. We always do follow-up monitoring, and some sites we have been going to for at least 12 years now. Every year we go back because we want to make sure that nothing's coming back. And if we need to, we change our method in order to actually be effective. A lot of the wasted efforts that I see is when efforts stop midway through the management, and then it just comes back, and 2-3 years later it looks like you were never there at all. So have a plan, pivot, and monitor, and use the IPM toolbox, and just remember that invasive plant control is a marathon, it's not a sprint. All right, so that was a lot of information. Hopefully this kind of gets your brain going and gets you wanting to get started about the species that you might have in mind and you're looking to tackle. But what now, right? So we are a very small organization. There's only really 2 full-time staff members. It's myself and 2 part-time-ish staff members. So we can't actually help everyone. And I get about 50 emails a day. So I'm also not able to respond to everyone, especially in a timely manner. So what I'm hoping is to arm you with the resources and the ability to find out more information on your own in order to make your own game plan when it comes to invasive species management. So, how do you find reliable resources? First, we suggest that you look for something local. And when we talk about local, we're looking at our local biogeoclimatic zone, so the Pacific Northwest. Just because a resource from the Okanagan might say one thing, their drier climates might not be applicable in our wetter Northwest climates, right? So we want to use applicable resources that are local. You want to also check whether or not it's consistent. When we look for resources, we always check other resources to make sure that they're all saying the same things, right? You don't want to be accidentally using the one resource that says something completely different from what everyone else is saying, because it could be a new method. It could be something that's untried, untested. So always confirm that it is a consistent messaging. And then finally, any good, reliable resource out there will have sources. If they do not have sources, then keep looking. Anything that has good information should be able to trace it back to where it first came from. So look for the list of references at the end, look for the links that it should tell you where they got their information from, and check those again as well. Unfortunately, with the internet the way that it is, there's a lot of noise out there. And to be responsible human beings, we have to put in the effort and the legwork to make sure that we are using the appropriate information that is accurate and actually is not going to cause further damage. So some resources that I like to use include the best management practices from Metro Vancouver, so very local, in the Lower Mainland with us. They have a lot more resources because Metro Vancouver also has a lot more money and resources compared to the Fraser Valley, so they do have a lot more guides than we do. And then King County, so just south of us, and Whatcom County also has some really good resources. And I'm highlighting these two specifically because they both have the integrated pest management toolboxes categories that I mentioned when I was going through the list. So prevention, chemical, manual, cultural, biological, and then a control summary. These guides can give you a really good idea as to which methods are recommended, which methods are maybe to be used with caution, which methods are just not recommended at all. And these should give you a pretty good places to start when you're tackling the plants that you're targeting. But how do I know what plant that I'm targeting? There's a lot of plants out there, and I'll be honest, we don't know all of them either. Sometimes when we get photos, especially when they're not great photos, we have to do quite a bit of research on our end to figure out what exactly is it that we're looking at. Especially if the plants don't show flowers, or if it's too early or too late, it can be very difficult to ID. Some tools that we do use to help us include the Seek iNaturalist app or PlantNet. Picture this, these are all really helpful tools as apps to help us figure out what we're actually looking at, or at least give us a starting place. Don't trust these entirely. Use them as guides and a good starting spot, and then confirm by looking those species up, Googling it, checking your plant guides to make sure that that actually is what you're looking at. If you are new to plant ID, I always recommend starting with the flowers first, because that's the easiest thing to spot. Count the petals, count the extra stem attachments. Some of those can be very distinctive and very identifiable. Next would be leaves and then stems. But eventually, once you get the hang of things, these apps can be a very helpful resource for identifying plants. And then lastly, I just want to leave you with further links to even more information. And these are really good places to start as you're getting onto your invasive plant management journey, because they have a lot of information and they are all sourced so that you can keep learning more about the plant that you're tackling, the control methods that are recommended, and next steps and other considerations that you might have to keep in mind when you're tackling those invasive plants. And thank you for spending your evening again listening to me. Hopefully that wasn't too much information, but this will be recorded so you can watch this as many times as you'd like on YouTube. Here's our information. Please feel free to get in touch. If you have any questions, we'll do our best to respond to you. It might not be timely, but we will get back to you eventually. And yeah, thank you so much. I'll stop sharing and so I can see any questions in the chat box.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That was wonderful, amazing. All right, so we do have some questions. The first one is from Patty, and she's curious about buttercups.
Yep, that's a hard one. It's really difficult. That's one that I would say is quite widespread. If you've got a little bit of it, then maybe it's worth the effort. But if it's, for example, your entire yard, it might be a little too late to tackle it. So in those cases, typically when it comes to large infestations, I tell folks to kind of look at the space that you're tackling and look at what you're trying to protect. Is it a play area for your kids? You want that to be grass. Then if that's the case, then you clear an area, that's the grass, fun play area space, and then you kind of work out from there. And it will take longer, but eventually, if you do put in the persistence and efforts, you can keep that value space that you're trying to protect still functional for the use that you're looking for, right? But it really comes down to how much time you've got, how much ability you've got, and whether or not the space that you're trying to reclaim is worth your efforts in your mind. It's not an easy answer for sure with these widespread plants, unfortunately.
And Barb is curious about creeping bellflower. Do you have anything to say about that? I'm not sure what plant that is.
Creeping bellflower. Is it like bluebells? Okay. Yes. Okay. So creeping bellflower. Actually, we can look at it right now. So creeping bellflowers, it produces 15,000 seeds per plant. And it is a root fragment spreader. So it sounds, and it's also resistant to some herbicides. You have a fun one. So yes, unfortunately, so this is a prime example of a plant that you're going to have to use multiple different methods on it, right? You're going to want to tackle it before it goes to seed because it can produce 15,000 seeds per plant. It has tiny root fragments, meaning that it's likely something that you're going to have to either dig up and remove all the pieces if you can. And if you can't, maybe that's a candidate to consider herbicides. And it says resistant to some herbicides. I would have to do further information searching to see what type it's resistant to. But if from the sounds of this, if it is resistant, then I would fall back to manual removals and just remove the roots and dig it up before seed set as much as possible. And again, it's going to be difficult because a lot of invasive plants are just tenacious that way. But with invasive plant management, it is more about persistence and using a bunch of different methods than it is a one silver bullet kind of way of tackling invasive plants. So unfortunately, it sounds like maybe just digging it up and continuing to dig it up is the best course of action before seed set.
Does anybody else have any questions that they want to ask Cassie before we wrap up?
Blackberries depends which blackberries. we do have native blackberries. So we do have like native blackberries are actually very low growing. But the big ones that you see in the ravines, that's Himalayan blackberries, and that is invasive. And they're very pointy and painful thorns is actually one of the reasons why they're so difficult to remove, because it hurts, right, in order to remove it. Um, so it is quite widespread here. There's not a lot of work being done on it because it is just simply too costly, and only some areas are receiving treatments for blackberries. But if you ever drive along the Sea to Sky Highway, Himalayan blackberries might be invasive in the Lower Mainland. It is not present past Squamish. So when we talk about prioritization, that's kind of where that comes in. A species that is so widespread and well established here, so much that not a lot of people even put any effort into it, aside from clearing it where they can. In Squamish and north of it, it becomes higher priority because it's not established there. So in those areas, treating it is even more important. So if you are tackling it, if it's just a roadside crew mowing the blackberry down, they're probably just trying to slow it down. If there's a full management plan for blackberry, typically it's a remove it or clear it, keep the canes from getting too high in the spring and preventing seed spread. And then you come in the fall and you either dig the roots up or you apply an herbicide so that it uptakes it down into the roots as it's preparing for winter dormancy. So this Himalayan blackberry is a really good candidate for the multiple methods, right? You tackle it in the spring, slow it down, prevent seed spread, and then you come back in the fall and then you tackle the roots, and you actually use methods that either remove or kill the roots in order to get those results. But then once you clear it, there's a lot of empty space. So a proper plan would actually also involve replanting that empty space so that the blackberries have competition so that they would not keep coming back year after year. It does spread by roots, so the fragments can spread, but the seeds also make a difference. That's because we eat those berries, right? And those berries can become seeds and be spread that way. Good competition for blackberries would be things that one, prevent it from growing. It's called arcing. So you'll see the canes kind of do this thing where it kind of grows up and then it bends over, and then where it touches, that point will root, and then that's another plant and it roots there, and then from there it starts arcing again. So anything that prevents that arc touching and rooting is good competition. Anything that prevents it from even arcing at all, so other shrubs, like taller shrubs, blackberries actually don't do super well in shade. So anything that can shade it out can also help too. So, I mean, that's not always an option because only things that are taller than blackberries are like trees. But if that's an option, if you're planting a bunch of trees that can shade out the blackberries, that can also help too. It won't be a silver bullet, like I mentioned, but it will add to the list of things that will help to slow it down. Yeah. Yes, yeah. So they do strive, they really thrive in sunny areas. They really love that sun, right? So shade, they don't love it very much, and they will be slowed down in the shade. Yeah. Yes, cutleaf blackberries are also invasive as well. Not as common as invasive species go, but they do exist. And they're also a little easier to remove because they're not as painful and the roots aren't quite as deep. Blackberries and those fast-growing trees together in your yard. Very large area. Is it worth having it excavated? I don't know if I would be able to make that decision for you. Excavation's a big decision to make. Do you Yeah, without knowing what the trees are, I wouldn't know whether or not they are native trees. There are invasive trees as well. But that excavation, like I would say, if you are planning to do large scale work like excavation, then it's even more important to have a game plan. Where is the material going? What are you going to do with that empty space afterward? Are you planting? Are you covering it up? Are you introducing seeds? And then the material that you're removing, is it going to an appropriate location? If you're keeping it on your property, are you going to control any regrowth? Will you monitor it for any regrowth so that you're not just simply moving the problem to another part of your property? So, yeah.
Well, if anybody has any more questions, where can I find a place to know the right questions to ask an excavator? Patty's curious about that.
Excavator, I don't actually know anything about excavators and like that large scale kind of work. I would suggest talking to a landscaper, and seeing what they suggest. I unfortunately I don't know too much about the big tools and equipment. So yeah, I won't be very much help there. But it's always helpful when you're talking to contractors and looking for someone to hire. If you're dealing with invasive plants, ask if they are used to dealing with that type of plant. Most contractors out there will have a range of plants that they're used to dealing with or have experience dealing with them. And you want to try to hire someone who knows what they're doing, and more often than not, they also know where they're supposed to bring it, right? The material that you remove. So if you actually go to our website, we have a list of contractors for invasive plant management. So like usually treating knotweeds, etc., not excavation. But there's a list of questions that I tell residents to ask when you're looking to hire someone. And those questions might be a good starting point for you to kind of keep in mind when you're searching for a company to hire. And then Diego has a question about how long it would take to eradicate knotweed with proper treatment. It depends on the site. If the knotweed has been mowed a lot, meaning the roots have been pushed further away and further deeper, it can take a long time. There have been sites that I've been working on where it was a plant and then they put more dirt on top of it. And so then the knotweed grew through that dumped material on top, and those can take even longer. So it really depends on like the site location and the site history of it. Typically, if it's a plant that hasn't really been mowed, hasn't really been like bothered too much, and it's contained, it's a small enough size. The ballpark that that companies will say is about 3 to 5 years. But again, that depends on the site history, where it is, how accessible it is. Are there any other situations or variables that might impact whether or not this plant grows? Some years, if we have a really hot year, the plant might not uptake the herbicide very well because it's so hot that the plant shuts down, and then we don't see as good of a result, right? So it can be year to year variable too. So like all things invasive species, it's difficult to give a straight answer just because it is very dependent and very variable. Yeah. Hopefully that answers your question though.
Well, thank you, everyone. I want to say thank you to Kathy for her lovely presentation, and thank you to Lovepreet for monitoring the chat and putting all the links in there. We are going to wrap up, and we're going to send out a recording to everybody as soon as possible via email, and hopefully we can load it up onto our YouTube website pretty soon too. Awesome. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye.